land trust in this respect. There aren't too many of us actually in the nation who work in two different states at the same time, unless you're a national entity. We work in 45 towns in New Hampshire and Vermont. We conserve lands primarily using conservation easements. And I'm going to give today kind of a crash course in conservation easements, nuts and bolts, and then try to talk a little bit about how a conservation easement can benefit a farmer or a farm transfer. We've protected 46,000 acres in the Upper Valley at this point, and we're conserving more every day. And the goal is, with land conservation, is to make sure that we protect those working farms and forests that are critical for this area, that we're protecting scenic areas, that the Upper Valley continues to attract people to live here because we've protected its most important resources. When it comes to farmland, we're looking at good soils, good water, everything we talked about today, and the need to ensure that we're not placing homes on those places where we want to be able to be growing food for ourselves in the future. So just in general, they're in your packet. I passed around at the last minute. There is a copy of the slides that I will be presenting today. And a checklist is one of the slides. This is something that I thought might be really helpful for you all if you come across a conservation easement. I'll go over this checklist and everything on it in detail today. Other materials in the handout, I won't go through each of these specifically, but for instance, conservation easements, frequently asked questions. This is a really handy worksheet to go to just give you a good sense of what's allowed, what's not allowed, and what are the goals of land conservation. You might have a landowner seeking to buy land that they can conserve. Selecting a conservation strategy is a good handout that you can provide to them or direct them to our organization to have a discussion. There are tax benefits for folks who donate conservation easements, and there may be, again, someone who is interested in purchasing land and then potentially conserving it for tax purposes. There's a worksheet or a handout on the basics of tax benefits for land conservation. That's all I'll do right now. Let's just get into the presentation. We'll cover what is a conservation easement, what to know when you're buying and selling conserved property, and farm-specific issues associated with conservation easements. So a conservation easement is a legal agreement. It's recorded. Generally, it restricts or limits subdivision and development on a property. It's intended to run with the land, and it's permanent. The goals, there are purposes in every conservation easement, generally to protect ecological, scenic, and productive values of a particular property. Allowable uses, all of our conservation easements, most of our conservation easements, we are doing some wildland easements now, but are for continued farming and forestry, and to promote or to allow for continued low-impact recreation, education, other activities to sustain the resources of the property. So again, pretty much everything but that development and subdivision at the top. And the goal again being that even if there's a mortgage placed on the property afterwards, or the property is sold, or potentially condemned, that the majority of condemnation is the exception here, but that the easement would stay in place even after it is sold or there's no mortgage placed on top of it.
So if you have a conservation easement for agricultural purposes,
Yes.
is somebody supposed to be building on that and support agriculture?
It usually. If it's for an agricultural purposes, most of our conservation easements would allow that. There may be some requirements that the farmer contact us first, and we locate it off of prime soils. But generally, in order to keep it a working farm, we're encouraging and we're allowing for ag buildings on the protected property. Yes. And I will talk about that a little bit more. I might as well just talk about it now. You need to be careful if you sell an agricultural property that, and if you're able to, if it sells to someone who's not a farmer, they will only be able to use that barn if it's on the protected property for ag purposes. They can't convert it to an office or a home or store their antique cars in it if it was intended for agricultural purposes.
Who checks on that?
Good question. So with each of these conservation easements that we hold, every year we monitor the properties. So we'll contact landowners, we'll be in touch with them. We're there to answer questions throughout the year about management, forest management, farm management, whether or not they can build a pond. But every year we also walk the property and we monitor it and go through a checklist with the landowner.
What would happen if they had, what penalty or who enforces that?
Our organization would enforce any violations on the property.
What would the violations be? What's the penalty of that?
Sure. Well, we could go to court to enforce something. So, I would say we actually, knock on wood, but we haven't had too many violations in the 27 to 30 years that we've been around. We have very good communications with each of our landowners. We make sure people understand what's allowed and what's not. And all of you as real estate brokers, I think it's really important. This is a checklist of information that you should be looking for when you know that there's a conservation easement on a piece of property. But you know, the easement speaks to enforcement, and it speaks to what sort of the process that we would go through if there was a violation of easement. Minor violations occur here and there. They might have to do with cutting wood without a forest management plan, or cutting in a non-sustainable manner. It might have to do with putting up a structure without first consulting us, and if it's an ag structure, we'll work with the landowner thereafter to be sure that it's not on soils that are important. We'll move it. If it's a structure that's not allowable, then we'll take it down.
If you have a checklist, for instance, are there any unresolved violations? If we were bringing the buyer, where do we search for find any unresolved?
Let me work down through. I'll get there. But typically, it's from you want to contact the land trust that holds the conservation plan. So I'm going to go through each of these points on its own, but get a copy of the conservation agreement. And I'll explain the best place to get that in a minute. Who are the holders, or who are the grantees of this conservation easement, and who's the primary contact? You might find 5 co-grantees on a conservation easement. You need to find out who's the primary contact. It's often the land trust versus the state entities. What parcels or portions of the property are conserved? Maybe the landowner owns 5 parcels and only 2 of them are conserved, or there are certain excluded areas. What are the residential uses? Is subdivision allowed? Is development allowed, if at all? What obligations and restrictions? What other obligations and restrictions that go along with the easement should the landowner know about, or buyer? Every easement has something called a notice requirement. This is really important. We'll go over that in a minute, but it has to do with notifying the land trust when the land sells. Are there a right of first refusal or an option to purchase at agricultural value. This could be embedded in the easement. It could also be recorded with the conservation easement. So someone's going to be asking about these, ask the land trust, ask the landowner, and make sure someone's doing a good title search. And then there's unresolved violations. These would be violations with, associated with the conservation easement. So you can ask the land trust if there are unresolved violations. Has someone recently done a timber cut? Mike was mentioning before, someone goes to sell the property, they might cut something and be in violation of current use, but they might also be in violation of their conservation easement. And then a conditional approval, and I'll talk about those. So, go to the direct source to get your conservation easement. I would encourage you to get it from your town office or your registry. A copy from the landowner might not be the final copy that was signed and recorded. And if you don't get it from either of those sources or that's unreasonable, call the land trust. And the agreement can go by a variety of names. Conservation easement deed, that's most commonly used by our organization. You'll see this grant of development rights and conservation restrictions, mostly in Vermont. Warranty deed reserving restrictions. If a land trust owns a piece of land first, they'll sell it out as this warranty deed with reserve restrictions. You might also look for amendments or restatements, and whether or not there's public access on the property. I'll talk about the option later. When you get a hold of an easement, look at the Schedule A, property description, and the back of the easement. That's going to tell you which portions of the property are restricted. There'll also be often there are some definitions up front of the easement describing the premises as being everything and the protected property as being a portion of that. Might be 2 or 3 different places to look. Some easements allow for subdivision, some don't. That's something that's negotiated up front in the conservation easement by the landowner who conserves the land. And with a piece of farmland, it's going to depend a lot on whether or not subdivision, if a farm is subdivided, if it will remain viable as a farm unit. Many of the funders who help fund conservation will place limitations on how many times a farm can be subdivided because they want to retain something that's viable and that continues to be productive in the future. State and federal funds are being used to protect many of these farms, and it's critical that they stay viable without division. Sorry about that. There are other restrictions in a conservation easement in general. They're there to ensure that the property is used in an environmentally friendly way, sustainably. We require forest management plans, so if you're in New Hampshire and land has been protected or is conserved and it's being forested or cut, there would be a forest management plan that you could seek from that seller if you're a buyer buying that land.
One thing I didn't mention earlier, if you look at somebody who wants to get a forest management plan done on their property, you can start with having a talk to the county forester, who can give them a list of consulting foresters in the county that they can work with.
A little bit about the notice requirement. get notified when land transfers. We don't know, I mean, more often than not, we're not, surprisingly, we are often not notified. So if I can ask all of you to make sure that the closing attorney knows that they have to contact the land trust if they haven't already. I mean, it is surprising, but you know, what happens is that we get notice that a piece of land is on the market, so someone gathers all the information, but we don't get tied into the end when the actual agreement is taking place, or you know, the contract is finishing up.
Question about that.
Do you have to sign a new lease with the owner, or does that just transfer with the warranty deed?
Did you say lease?
Right, if the property is sold, do you have to
We
sign
don't have to
something?
do anything, it runs with the land. But it'll be in the land records, but it's not always, it has to be, the easement requires that it's referenced in the deed. But there are attorneys who forget to do that too. So, again, we're there to be a resource. I would encourage you to reach out to us. The sooner we know about a transaction that might be occurring, the better. And then we can help to make sure that, you know, notice happens in the proper manner and the deed references the conservation easement as it should. And, you know, the buyer has all the information they need. So this goes to the legality question. So yes, if there is an unresolved violation on the property, that becomes the liability of the new buyer. So this is really important to find out. Again, I can't think of any time this has happened, but it hasn't happened with our organization, unfortunately. Approvals, conditional approvals. So a landowner might, the agricultural barn question came up. There may be, someone may have requested from our organization an approval. This is something that's allowed in the easement, but there's a condition that says it's allowed so long as you get permission from the conservation entity, from the land trust to do this activity. Conditional approvals might also have to do with forest management plans, where they're good for a specific use or for a specific landowner. You just want to be sure that the buyer is fully aware of what conditional approvals or what approvals have been granted already. In the agricultural barn situation, it was to build a barn for agricultural purposes, but that would need to stay, being, you know, the use would need to continue for agriculture. And the situation with the forest management plan, you know, a forest management plan is dynamic, and we want that to happen. We want, you know, a plan to, one landowner to have goals to manage their forest in a certain way, and the next landowner to have a different goal if they wish. But the easement it does describe a process by which that management plan with each landowner or each change, it needs to get approved by the land trust, just to be sure that it still complies.
Let's say you had a barn for agricultural purposes. That owner runs into some kind of difficulty, financially or whatever, and really needs to do something else with that barn. Are there circumstances that the trust then allows something else to be done? In other words, there is some subjectivity in this land trust?
Well, so there are two things. Maybe the barn, not all barns are on the protected land, so maybe they're in an envelope. I have to just point that out, that there are typically building envelopes on every conserved parcel, and they may include a number of the structures. And we're often looking to design an envelope that allows some flexibility in the future in case something like that happens. So if it's a farm, if we're protecting a farm and that farm might be, it's not clear that that farm will continue as farming in the future, which will likely put that structure, if we can, in an envelope that gives some flexibility. That said, every easement is different and every parcel is different. So in your example, no, we wouldn't be able to allow for another use of an agriculture there, but the landowner, we could work with them to see if someone else could lease it, if someone else might store hay there, if there was another way to allow a farmer or farming use to continue in that structure, even if it wasn't that particular landowner. Okay, on to the fund. Farm-specific issues associated with easements. Again, every easement is different, and the agreements that we have on commercial farms and forests are very different than those on the typical residential property that just has attached forest and non-commercial farmland. As I mentioned before, all of our easements require sustainable harvesting and farming practices. These are intended to protect water quality and soil resources. As Mike was indicating before, we are seeing a situation in the state of Vermont where the parcels that we protected in Vermont with using state and federal funding, we're now engaging in a process where we're putting together very comprehensive agricultural plans for the property to ensure that the farming practices that are going on the property are going to be consistent with state water quality requirements. Again, much of this is driven, we obtain funding from USDA, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to purchase conservation easements on farmland. The funding that's coming, the source of that funding is the Farm Bill, and as of 2014, there are some very strict requirements about these agricultural land plans that go on. You might have a nutrient management plan, you'll have a crop plan, you'll have a, if you have enough forest land, the forest management plan all gets wrapped into one. But a potential buyer would be, you want them, you'd be asking questions to figure out whether or not the particular farm that's being purchased has one of these great resources for the next farmer to have and adopt, but also, or requirements that these need to be in place.
Question. Are these plans recorded with the easement?
They are not recorded. So generally they are put together by, with professional assistance or professional help through USDA. So NRCS, through extension or through their district offices, they are helping us put together the plans with the farmer when we protect the land. And again, they're dynamic, so the next farmer could come in and want a whole different plan, but it needs to go through an approval process.
USDA and RCS should have those plans.
Yes.
Doesn't give us the access.
You won't. One thing to say about USDA and many of you through the Farm Service FSA, those who seek FSA loans would know this, but they're very protective of information. And I can't go and ask for a conservation plan on a piece of farmland that's protected by our organization. I need to get the farmer to make that request to release that information. So it would be through the seller that you would seek that information.
But Harrison's point, so you got the easement, say, 4 years ago, and you had the plan and therefore the runoff plans and all of that.
Yeah.
But you're saying now you're updating or changing. I'm in Vermont. Now, is that done with the acquiescence or the agreement of the owner, the same owner that had, so granted the easement? Or is it perfunctory that as part of what they've done with this easement, as plans or evolution of changes they are obligated to implement those, is they evolve and change?
Yeah, so two things there. I just want to clarify, the new requirements for these larger plans is coming with a new farm bill. So any lands that are being protected today going forward are required to have that level of plan. Older easements or farmland that was protected 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there still is probably a little plan that was put together at that point, but it has more flexibility. The bigger concern is the state, you still need to adhere to these required agricultural practices that are coming down the pipe.
I just meant that it was automatic, the trust basically said, who will do this?
Right, no, that's going forward, new farmland. And what we do is we touch base with the landowner once a year, as I said, with these parcels with the bigger plans. We ask them if they've made any changes or if they need to make any changes. If they do, we put them in touch with the right people. But that's about the level that we go.
The requirement is for them to have a plan. It doesn't, so it's their plan still. It doesn't mean it's not doing certain other requirements. They're still planning to do that. Is there a question like that?
If somebody sells the rights to conservation on the property, does the state actually contribute towards the payment of the property taxes for that portion which was sold over to the conservation?
Yeah, no, that was probably on a slide and I skipped over that one. So with a conservation easement, the landowner still continues to own the land, manage the land, and pay the taxes. So the state does not pay a portion, but often all of these parcels are enrolled in current use anyway, so that they're at the lowest tax level.
These plans that you talked about run with the owner?
Not necessarily. A new owner, just, so I would think of them a little like a forest management plan in current use. You can adopt someone's, as a new buyer, you can adopt their current use plan and take on their forester and all, or you can create a new plan and do your own thing. You don't have to. You could, because it's easier in that transition to adopt it. But, I think if you had a commercial buyer for a farm who, you have a farm that's been growing strawberries and you have someone coming in who's going to plant has a whole new idea of what they're going to cultivate, they would be working on that plan early on in the process before they even buy the property and running that by NRCS to get some approvals.
They're not watching.
Yeah, and they're not, even if you're dealing with flat farmland, it's not going to be difficult to get these approved. If you're trying to grow row crops on steep soils, that's where you want to run into trouble. Highly erodible lands or wetlands. Those are the critical areas. But any farmer is going to know that. Someone who's been farming for a while. I do want to talk a little bit about these rights of first refusal and options to purchase at ag value. I'm not going to talk a lot in depth, but I will point you to two handouts in your packet. These are put together by the Vermont Land Trust for another talk that they did with Land for Good. The reason I don't have my own, our organization actually doesn't, we hold rights of first refusal, and I'll describe what that is. It's as you know it, but it's for a different purpose. But we don't hold this purchase to, option to purchase at agricultural value. We hold we hold easements that include these, but we are not the party that gets called to activate it in our particular situation. Just because we're a smaller organization, we're not staffed to review farm plans, and it requires quite a bit of oversight. But if you want to know the nuts and bolts of how they work, these options to purchase at ag value, after, that's a good place to look at these two pieces of paper, or you can consult with someone at the Vermont Land Trust if you have a property that was subject to this. So, sometimes the holders will reserve this right of first refusal or option to purchase. And the reason we do this is to try to keep the land in farming or affordable to a farmer. So imagine that you have someone who's selling a piece of land, a buyer, they can't find a farmer to purchase it. This isn't the right of first refusal situation. It goes up for sale, and it's in a community that is active farming community, but there's a non-farm buyer purchasing it. Our organization or the state of Vermont, these are typically in Vermont. These are all in Vermont, actually. We don't have any of these in New Hampshire. So in Vermont, we can step in and purchase that at the asking price if we wanted to buy it and then try to resell it to a farmer. The option to purchase at ag value works in a similar manner. It's actually on its own sheet here. Requires that the holder be notified when the property is under contract, and it can only be exercised when it's not going to a commercial farmer or to someone in the family. So there's a couple of waiver situations or exemption situations. If a commercial farmer is purchasing that land, that commercial farmer will need to provide their farm plan and everything else to the entity who's going to review it. It's going to be the state in our situation or the Vermont Land Trust. And if it's going to a family member, typically it's just a call to the land trust or the state and letting them know that this transfer is going to happen to a family member and it's exempt from this option. But in any event, at some point, the holder needs to waive their right to exercise this option. And they would be, the option to purchase it at a value that's determined by an appraisal that was conducted originally at the time of the purchase of the conservation easement and then adjusted over time. I'm not going to go into all the details of that. It's very, again, these are decisions that I don't have the expertise to provide you with all of that detail today, but you should know that they exist. And it's really important to disclose this up front because it takes time for this to happen. And the easement lays out a time frame to allow these decisions, the plans to be reviewed and a decision to be made to either waive or to exercise the option. That's the critical information really there. And again, another piece that I just want to explain how we work with land for, another way we work with land for good, but with anyone who might come in your office, you might have someone who wants to buy a farm, comes to the Upper Valley and can't afford a piece of farmland, looks for a piece of land that has not been conserved and maybe wants to buy a farm. One of the ways we work a lot with farmers who are seeking to buy farmland and using the sale or using the purchase and sale to make the land more affordable. So let me just give you an example. And this may come up in a situation where a farmer's been leasing land for a long period of time. and they get to a point where they want to buy the land. We have a couple of these going on right now where the owner's aging off the land, the farmer wants to purchase the land, can't afford it. We are purchasing a conservation easement or the development rights off of the property at the time of the purchase of the land to bring the value down for the farmer, so the farmer just pays that after value. This is a really, a lot of farm transitions happen this way. That's one way to kind of bring the land value down so it's affordable. Another way is through these options to purchase at ag value. It tries to keep it down at that level and at that value in the future.
I think it would be useful to say that it's not an insignificant amount. It's not uncommon for half of the value of the property to be developed rights. You may have a farm that's selling for $600,000. The development rights are worth $300,000, and so the farmer is going to pay $300,000 to the seller, and then the conservation organization with the funds from USDA and from the state and sometimes private fundraising will come pay the seller the other $300,000. So the seller is kept whole in this, but the farmer is supplying the farmer half the cost.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, on the annual monitoring program, is that conducted by paid professional staff of the Upper Valley Land Trust or mostly by volunteers?
It's a combination of both. So usually about at least every 3 years, we're on every property. We have close to 500 parcels now protected. So we can't, we have 3 full-time stewardship staff, but they can't be on every property every year. I will say that on our more complex properties like farms, we're typically the eyes and ears on those properties every year. But we also train volunteers to be our eyes and ears, or at least the first step of that before we, to get on the ground, do some of that monitoring.
Vermont Land Trust sometimes would hire college interns to do this as part of their summer job. I was leasing a conserved farm, and for a few years, and every year this behind the ears kid would show up and ask me if there's been any changes. I said, well, not until we got our Act 250 permit. That's not on my form.
There was a move afoot a couple of years ago by the Vermont Land Trust to change some of the criteria regarding perpetuity. Is that all gone away? Or?
It's gone away for now, yes. There have been, I think at this point it's gone away. I mean, our organization had a different opinion as to how to go about potential changes to easements. And we voiced those. At this point, they're in the state of New Hampshire. There is a process by which an easement could be amended, and I think the goal was to create a process in Vermont by which something could be amended. Amendments aren't taken lightly, or we don't take them lightly. We will amend a conservation easement to add more land or to correct errors in a past conservation easement. And in New Hampshire, they have to go to the AG's office for approval and review. Any of them, even just adding land, so definitely, but everything is reviewed through the AG's office. We don't have an equivalent oversight entity right now in Vermont, so it was this process to talk about what could be done in Vermont, and at this point, we still don't have a process. But again, our standpoint, if someone comes to us and wants to amend an easement to take away provisions, it can't happen.
More questions?
I'm just trying to think of anything else associated with the farm transaction piece that might come.
Thanks, just so your notes. I'll mention that there's the last brochure, the last document on the right side of your handouts is a brochure from the Vermont Land Trust. One of the twists that they have done on this is that because the conservation easement funding continued a long time to generate all the funds, and some sellers are not willing to wait, they've started in the last 7 or 8 years going into the Farmland Access Program and actually buying the farms pre-conserved at a pre-conserved price. Then they put out a request for proposals and for farmers to come in and make proposals of what they're going to do with the farm. They will make a decision not based on the price, because they've already got this figured out. They've got that figured out by an appraisal where they know what the conserved value is. It's basically on the use of the farm and who's going to be the best farmer to fit that. They've done several of these. There's one not too far from here in Norwich that they did about 3 years ago. There's one that they did about 3 years ago in Weathersfield, Vermont. And so if you already have any work as a buyer broker with anyone, you want to make them aware of that program, because when they get notice on that, they can put in their proposal.
Yeah, and that will happen on those two examples were, actually one of them was a conserved farm first, but we actually have a parcel of land we're working with the Vermont Land Trust as well through the state program. So we have a piece of land in Corinth that's for sale. It's a dairy farm and it's a cheese operation, and it just went through sort of the farm access piece. They put it out to bid. Bids came in from farmers who were seeking to potentially buy this farm. The farmer who owned the property reviewed the bids. They ended up picking someone in their own town. Potentially it's still being negotiated and worked on, but there may be a buyer in place. Again, it's just another resource. I really don't know how that would be any different than what Land for Good could do as well, but this particular report to the Vermont Land Trust to do that.
So as we get into the home stretch here, just a couple of more topics to go over relatively quickly. I want to remind you that we have this evaluation form. It was originally on the front left side of your handout booklet. You could please fill that out before you leave. I put a box on the chair in the back so you can drop it in there on the way out. I also want to mention that on this table over here, I put up sign-up sheet for our organization if you'd like to receive our e-newsletter and otherwise be interested in following up with us. Feel free to sign that before you leave. I also mentioned I did have that pile of farm publications that we referenced earlier as potential places to advertise and look at before we leave. Again, evaluation forms are really, really important for us. We really want to make this a better course and find out what we did well, what we didn't. So please fill that out before you leave. I wanted to say a couple words on farm financing options for farmers, because there are options other than conventional banks for farmers that you may not be aware of. For one, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Farm Service Agency, or FSA, has various loan programs for farmers, including loan programs for beginning farmers. One of the farmers that I'm working with right now who's working on buying a farm is trying to decide between their direct loan program, where they can get I can't remember what the interest rate is now, it's 2 point something for 40 years. Or if she goes with their down payment program, where she has to put up 5%, USDA will loan 45% for the remaining part of the down payment, which is quite a down payment, at, I think it's down around 1% interest, it's still around 1% interest. for 20 years, for 45% of it. The other half, what USDA does is provide a guaranteed loan. So a loan guarantee, they'll work with a conventional lender, and they will provide a guarantee, so they will take on a higher risk loan that they might not otherwise do. And so the USDA will guarantee that if the buyer defaults, that that USDA, I think, makes them 95% whole on the loan. So loan guarantees get used quite a bit, and sometimes they get used without either the down payment program, the direct loan program. In Vermont, we have VEDA, which is the Vermont Economic Development Authority. Their interest rates are not as good as FSAs. They tend to be more in line with bank rates, but they will often take on higher risk operations. For a lot of conventional banks, a farm by itself is considered a high risk. I think probably any of you dealt with banks and people with self-employment income, you know that by itself, just self-employment income gives a lot of lenders concern. When you add to it a farm business, particularly if it's a younger farm business without a track record, or right now conventional dairy with milk prices fluctuate a lot, and they're toilet again. So most conventional banks are leery of a lot of farm loans. And so in Vermont, VEDA can come in very often as a lender. Very often they're teamed up with FSA, so they may be in that scenario I just gave, they may be the other 50%, and then USDA is still providing them a guarantee on the 50% that VEDA is going. Then there's farm credit. All of Vermont and most of New Hampshire is covered by Yankee Farm Credit. They have an office in White River Junction and then an office in Middlebury. They do farm loans. They're a cooperative. They tend to be a little bit more conservative because they're putting members' money on the table with loans. So they're less conservative in who they fund than FSA or VEDA. They also do a lot of forestry and maple loans, and so even as farm credit, they're another lender to consider for those kind of purchases. Their interest rates tend to run more in the market rate, but because you become a member of a cooperative, while they never will guarantee it, there's often a dividend that comes back to members, borrowers who are members. And so for the last several years, the buyers may be borrowing at 5%, but then they get a dividend back from Yankee at the end of the year equivalent to 1% interest reduction. And they've been, they can never guarantee because it depends on the performance of the company, but they've been very typical of late. They've been able to offer back that 1%, equivalent 1% dividend, but never guarantee it. They also have a program called Farm Start, where they're trying to get more loans for beginner farmers. In southeast New Hampshire, so really out of the territory that most of you are probably from, you get into Farm Credit East. And so that part of southeast New Hampshire, and I don't know exactly where the break is part of the Farm Credit Co-op that stretches from Maine through southern England into New York. So in this pocket, it's Yankee Farm Credit, a little entity there. And for all of these loans, appraisals are going to be really, really critical for these lenders. They're not going to make any kind of loan for in many cases if the property is not appraised at high enough value. That's generally the case with most any lender. They're going to be putting a little bit more on the appraisal when you look at it. Of course, if the buyer has the capacity to make up the difference, they will, then it just means that they're still at their loan-to-value ratio that the lender wants to be at. But particularly with a lot of these farm loans, the farmers are also borrowing from these same entities for cattle, equipment, greenhouses, water meters and such. And so the lender is going to be looking at their whole package, and they're very concerned if they're paying too much for any of it, whether it be cows or real estate. And so, particularly if they want to also see the farmers, because these are commercial business loans, they also want to see the farmer have enough working capital on hand so that they can cash flow the business. And when they don't, very often they're taking on additional operating loans, maybe a seasonal operating loan, but still an additional loan that they're going to consider. And so all of a sudden cash, they were taking into consideration that was going to be used for working capital is now being used up because the farm didn't appraise high enough, and the buyer is desperate to get this farmer is trying to make up the difference. It could influence other aspects of their farm loan package. It's going to make getting the entire package they need to have happen work. Any questions about farm lending? So if you're working with a buyer broker, as a buyer broker, or if you have, even if you're working as a seller broker, and there's a person on the other end that's unaware of these farm programs, I definitely recommend that you suggest to send people to Farm Service Agency at USDA, Vermont, VITA, and then both sides of the river amplified credit. Because they may be more likely to get financing.
And Mike, you also could be a conduit for that as well, correct?
Yeah.
Just say, hey, Mike, that's everything your thoughts, and we can have also assist.
That's right, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things is, as we were wrapping up that, I wanted to just re-emphasize is that we're doing this not as just a one-time thing. We want to be a resource to you and to your clients, and so we hope to hear from you outside of this to follow up on any of the topics we talked about, and whether you've got a seller or a buyer that could use more technical assistance on that. We'd love to be a resource for you. And I know that if conservation easement is potential, then we'll take it well to hear from you as well.